Thanks, Michael. And I thought I was going to be the warm-up. I'm told to start with why nobody shouted stop. And upon reflection, I thought that my own experience over the last 20 years would be of interest, because I think I did associate with people who did see what was going on and did try to start shop, or even shout stop, albeit ineffectually and usually and often humiliatingly. People who didn't really like the political and speculative classes and sometimes even gave them a hard time in return for their patronizations. I remember Bertie Ahern, on the couple of occasions that I met him, used to look at me crookedly, I think that's the term, and ask me if I was still battling away. Well, battling was difficult and unpleasant, and no one really wanted to know, to share the joke. In fact, the joke often seemed to be on you. Battling didn't really do me or anyone else much good, because ultimately culture trumps everything, and we were, as a country, deliberately, even professionally, in political rape mode for so long. Opposing the culture was just a recipe for getting ganged up on TV and being left with your demons. Anyway, here's an early effort from me in 1991. I don't know if you can see it, but I published a leaflet for the local elections in 1991 called Politicians on the Fiddle, Vote Them Out, which dealt with what was the general practice in the county council, and the general lesson of which was what you can do, vote out the big parties, issued in the name of a improvised group called the Campaign for Honesty in Politics. Later I was involved in a whole series of leaflets dealing with proceedings on the county council, but here's another one, I think this is 1992, called Cherrywood, which was the rezoning with which I was involved with in South County Dublin. Cherrywood, how councillors voted, and it documented the ups and downs of the mysterious ups and downs of the voting records of different councillors, how initially they would vote against a rezoning and then at the last moment vote in favour of it. It listed councillors who'd strangely changed their minds. It said never trust them again, give them a call about it. So it was basically an attempt to hold councillors to account and to draw the public's attention to the fact that there was what anyone who was following the proceedings could only say were dodgy proceedings going on in the county council. So I seem to be hooked on this sort of approach. In 1997, I was involved in an initiative which resulted in the contents of the PD skip, some of you may remember that, with all their financial records being transferred to the Sunday Business Post. I suppose that was sort of trying to shout stop in its own way. And indeed, later on, I was involved in transferring Liam Lawler's tax return to the Sunday Business Post. In 1995, I was involved in presenting a Worse Ireland Award to AIB while they were presenting the Better Ireland Award next door. I was involved unsuccessfully in appealing Michael Lowry's corrupt Duns-funded extension in 1997 and successfully appealed Mary McAleese's greedy holiday home some years later. I tried to crucify Treasury holdings in the courts in 1997 because they were flouting European law and planning norms and buccaneering all over Dublin City, including rigging auctions and threatening to run people out of town. I made a complaint to the Standards and Public Office Commission about Shawnee Fitzpatrick's Docklands Authority and his conflicts of interest when he was still lording it around town in 1997, which led him to say that he was the victim of media McCarthyism. Unfortunately, the Standards and Public Office Commission found against me on a technicality. I suppose that was an attempt to shout stop in its own way. Between 1993 and 2001, I put my name to over 1,000 objections to bad developments up and down the country, including much one-off housing, which, whatever you'd say about it, is the antithesis of planning. Often I'd meet the developers as part of this process. They used to say that you joined the American Marines, meet interesting people and kill them. Well, with An Taisce, it was meet interesting people during the boom and destroy their dreams, because you'd be objecting to their schemes. But often you'd meet the developers. They'd be very presentable, clever architects in fashionable black polo necks, attractive young people, businessmen who, strangely, towards at least the end of the boom, used to always say that they were very keen, above all, to put something back. But nearly always, nevertheless, the developments they were proposing would be shocking. I suppose that was interesting culturally. the mismatch between the zeal of the people behind the planning applications and the quality of what they were applying for. At one stage, I was involved in organising someone to fly around the Bord Pleanála chamber and exit by the window during the oral hearing on the Dublin Airport development when it was considering the MAD Terminal 2 extension. And I even once, God forgive me, had Dick Roach trailed by someone dressed up as a two-sided cockroach. Dick Roach and cockroach. I was actually in Conways on Parnell Street more than 20 years ago when councillors from Dublin County Council used to retire for a few pints with Frank Dunlop and a couple of brown envelopes or bags. Indeed, I once had the great pleasure of addressing the Fianna Fáil group on the old corrupt county council one evening in Conways in 1991 on the subject, of all things, of good planning in the county of Dublin. So I banged on, as you might expect, about the so-called new towns, Tallaght, Blanchardstown and Lucan Clondalkin, how they should be finished before the county council started looking at major new suburbs, while the Fianna Fáilers scoffed Mariettas and chattered away, like in a creche, really. After I droned on worthily for about 10 minutes about the common good, the Erda report and reinforcing the city centre, while councillors shouted amongst themselves and yawned, Councillor Betty Coffey intervened to announce that her party colleagues got my drift, and I was ushered out, still shouting about the Erda report. In 1991, I attended a meeting about the Carrickmines Valley. At the end of the meeting, on the periphery, I encountered Betty Coffey, who was a leading councillor for Fianna Fáil at the time. I had a pleasant, if somewhat dull, chat with her about zoning, although I think she was mainly interested in how suspiciously young I was then. And she said I should talk to Fianna Fáil's planning expert about the matter in hand. She beckoned to the shadows. Liam Lawler emerged and urbanely said that he was not in favour of rezoning the valley. The strange thing about this was that he wasn't even on the council at the time, having lost his seat in the local election just before that, and he had no obvious reason to be there at an obscure meeting in the distant southern suburbs. He seemed nevertheless to be fulfilling some sort of a role politically. 15 years later, it emerged that Fianna Fáil's planning expert had a financial involvement in the controversial Jackson Way site in the Carrickmines Valley, over which Frank Dunlop in the end was jailed. So I suppose that was an indication of maybe, to some extent, how it was done. On another occasion, when I was campaigning against rezoning of the Carrickmines Valley, immediately after the vote in the council office, I caught Councillor Olivia Mitchell hugging one of the developers whose scheme she had just changed her mind to support. I said, "Oh, kissy kissy with the developers." And she said, "Lucky you don't have a camera." I sort of felt that council shouldn't be so passionate about the interests of developers. Subsequently, it emerged that Councillor Mitchell had taken money from these developers before changing her mind. 20 years later, Fine Gael had forgiven her, though Mahon did say that her voting was inappropriate. Anyway, I spent a year of my life, way back then, campaigning against what the Mahon Tribunal in the end accepted was the corrupt rezoning of the Carrickmines Valley, primarily for Monarch properties. We had leaflets and banners, and were like flying columns, countering Monarch's expensive propaganda. They actually spent £800,000 at the time on their campaign, on television ads and so on, but also on Frank Dunlop and his largesse. Every time they moved, we'd attack them and vice versa. But in the end, we lost. Local residents had all gone through the democratic process, and through sheer force of money, we felt we'd lost to forces that we couldn't actually affect. We were distraught. We felt that we'd lost a corrupt vote. We tried everything, but it was clear we needed to go beyond the usual process of writing worthy letters to ministers. We needed to blow up the system, as it were. So we decided, a colleague of mine, Colin McGuckie, and I decided that we should offer a reward, £10,000 for information leading to the conviction of persons for rezoning corruption. Now, we had to do this through a Newry solicitor because none of the so-called progressive solicitors in the capital were willing to touch it. But anyway, eventually we had a flow of information. Some of it was rubbish. I think one person touched on the whereabouts of Shergar, for example. But some of it clearly was not. And we drip-fed this to journalists led by Frank Connolly. James Gogarty came to us with allegations about paying money to Ray Burke, who was then the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Gogarty didn't really want to talk to the press because he felt he'd been humiliated in his dealings with the Irish Times beforehand, didn't want to know about his story. Gogarty was actually obsessed with his pension, which really wasn't that interesting at all. And we had to persuade him that in order to embarrass his employers, Murphy's, about his pension and how he'd been treated, he had to tell his whole story about corruption to the press. That was the battle for us, to try and persuade him to share his story. And I suppose on that basis, we could see how reluctant he was to share it. We were convinced of his bona fides. He also had very comprehensive documentation. Anyway, the drip feed, week after week, during the silly season of summer 1995, corroded the body politic, which in the end gratifyingly panicked. Ray Burke resigned because, I suppose, the allegations ultimately were true. The planning tribunal was instigated to look into the allegations, and in the end, I suppose, it ultimately led to Bertie's resignation as well. Of course, it cost far too much, probably in the end 250 million euros, and it's done absolutely nothing to stop dodgy planning. And if you check out Cherrywood and the Carrickmines Valley now on the Braidghill Carriageway, you'll see that the once happy valley is now a moonscape. Some years after all of this, I thought to myself, how can I match the general misery of campaigning against rezonings in Dublin County, and fell upon the wheeze of objecting to the sort of poor developments that were being built in the city of Dublin. Ultimately, I became chairman of An Taisce, which purported to take the public interest in planning matters. That was an interesting insight as well into the culture of the time. Essentially, what I discovered was that both then and now, there's no change now, democratically driven local authority development plans and national plans such as the spatial strategy, created by politicians, are in fact essays in hypocrisy, as they're totally flouted by councillors acting as private representatives in effect, as opposed to public representatives, for vested interests of all sorts, from larger developers in the cities typically to one-off house builders in the country. If you own property and shout loud enough, you can get councillors to lean on officials to get what you want, especially in the frenzy of short-term greed that was our tiger. For example, a whole range of the biggest developments that are well known, for example, Spencer Dock, the Carlton site on O'Connell Street, the Children's Hospital, Liberty Hall, they all got permission, even though the local authority development plan doesn't allow it at all. And, for example, local authority development plans are normally against one-off housing, even though in most counties 60 or 70% of housing now is built one-off in the countryside. Officials do what they're told by developers. It was shout power. It is shout power. In the face of any vision of a planned common good, and in the face of democratically agreed policy. And An Taisce, which just championed the idea of following plans of denser communities, especially in towns outside of Dublin, so Dublin would not sprawl, got hammered in the process, got called the Ku Klux Klan. This was funny for the first few years, but ultimately I think you have to look at the legacy, which is essentially of nothing that you'd want. No new parks, playgrounds, no imaginative new civic spaces and new places to go, no bold new suburbs anywhere in the country. Instead, we have a legacy of what you'd expect if Bertie Ahern had planned it and built it all himself. Okay, so that's my own little background, but I'm going to talk about history more generally, and how it's led to our distorted sense of the common good. I'll look at who's getting in the way now of the common good. And then finally, I'll briefly look at the recommendations of Moriarty and Mahon and see whether they're being implemented and who should be prosecuted. So as regards the historical reasons for corruptions, I'm not really going to demur from Elaine's analysis in her recent book of why corruption happens or happened. And that culture, the culture that she outlines and the historical reasons for it, are particularly relevant to why no one really shouted stop in a way that signified that they meant it. Our history is of colonisation, leading among other things to rule breaking, the need for rule breaking, I suppose, and the demonisation of whistleblowers. Our history is of famine, leading to a lack of interest in the long term, an understandable lack of interest in the long term, and a lack of interest in the environment, and a view that planning is a luxury. We have a history of the inflation of the role of the big man, from Parnell through Haughey, through Ahern to Lowry. An obsession with civil war politics, and then the North, to the detriment of a vision of the public interest, on who ruled rather than on how they ruled. An interest in culture and the imagination to the detriment of the truth in politics, We have Catholic notions of sin and redemption, meaning venality was literally forgivable, and the elevation of sins of sexuality to the downgrading of sins of avarice or against the common good. So history made a big difference to our attitude to corruption. A history of famine, colonization, and the influence of the church. So I suppose in the broadest terms, that's what you could say why it was allowed to happen. I'm going to look briefly at what happened, because that's disputed, who allowed it, who promoted it, and what's happening now. I think what generated, the most important thing about what generated Mahon and Moriarty is that it's also what generated our wider collapse, including our economic collapse in the end. It was all part of the Ireland syndrome generated by our generation, by the generation of people who are in this hall today. I think that this generation in Ireland generated a once-in-a-century boom and allowed it to be hijacked by the corrupt and the greedy, pursuing no particular vision, with no regard for the long term. Our political classes, for the most part, offered no attractive vision of society and did not see the downturn coming. Fianna Fáil ruled the boom on endogenous short-termism and neoliberalism dressed up as socialism. Driven by their own bloated lifestyles, they behaved as if money was all that mattered. There was little need for regulation or planning, and there would never be a tomorrow. Opposition parties, of course, then didn't do their part of sceptically assessing our tax base, our banks, and our property sector. Worse even, our political parties evolved into interchangeability, which I think is still the case, increasing the inequality gaps in Irish society and losing any sense of ideology or vision, so that even the Labour Party in the end supported income tax cuts, and even the Green Party manifest the preference for rhetoric over action that had always characterised their unlikely brethren in Fianna Fáil. So who allowed the factors that led to the tribunals to happen? I suppose politicians, including people who history seems likely to judge as beyond reproach, like Garret Fitzgerald, and grandees like Derry Hussey, the Gardaí, the media, the regulators of all sorts, from the planning authorities to the banking regulator to the civil servants who worked on the fourth mobile phone licence. But more than just allowing it, there was also a class of people who promoted it. And I would say they're the sort of people who control Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the classes that tolerated Haughey and Lowry and still tolerate dodgy councillors who serve the private interest. The sort of people who have, I would say, these are the sort of people who have tax-driven investments or who might flog a one-off house even though they've got permission only for family use. The sort of people who lost the run of themselves during the boom. Think Quinn family. But of course, more complicatedly than that, the electorate itself, on many occasions, I think we would have reflectively to say, let itself down as well. So I think it's also important not to regard this as isolated history, to look at what's happening now. For example, to look at who at the moment is standing in the way of an overarching progressive vision of the common good and its implementation. And I suppose I'd say that it's politicians and the media. The likes of bankers and developers are gratifyingly beleaguered at the moment, and while they clearly made a big difference to policy in the past, I don't think you'd really say they're prime forces at the moment. So how are our politicians doing? Well, of course, mostly they're puppeted up by the IMF and Angela Merkel. And of course, they have a difficult job to do dealing with banking crisis and the budget deficit. But the game they seem to be playing is to regain international confidence and hope that someone spares us some few spare shekels as a result of the process. And I would say, well, that's not exactly edifying and certainly in no way ethical, that it does seem finally to be bearing some practical fruits, even if there were more exciting ethical alternatives. But beyond that, I think the point is that most of what led to the tribunals could happen again, is happening again, because the culture passed down from history to us hasn't changed. Admittedly, the omerta surrounding Charlie Haughey's wealth wouldn't survive these days, and I think it's unlikely that Liam Lawler would be appointed to Vice Chair of the Dáil Ethics Committee in 2012, as he was way back. But look at the culture of the Quinn family, at the impunity of Shawnee Fitz, at the Bailey brothers, unprosecuted, at Bertie and Ben Dunn, at the focus on the economy to the detriment of the social side, the environmental side, at judicial appointments, the indulgence of Dennis O'Brien and Michael Lowry, that the Taoiseach hasn't still accepted the Moriarty findings, at the general quality of planning decisions around the country, which is still shocking, at the treatments of bogs and septic tanks, for example, at Bertie Ahern battling for the star from behind the contents of a refrigerator, and Celia Larkin pontificating to us weekly on the issues of the day in the Sunday Independent. I would say there's an overwhelming lack of interest in this society in the growing inequality. I would say that the national discourse generally is erratic and analytical, as evidenced, for example, by the unfocused and unanalytical approach to property taxes, even on the left, or even especially on the left. And I suppose I would say, with my own particular sectoral bias in the environment, that if they can't get these things right, what chance is there of our body politic dealing with the biggest issue of our time, which is climate change? If we're worried about how future generations will judge us in terms of our economic incompetence, we're underestimating how much they'll detest us for allowing runaway climate change. As for the media, for me at the moment, in the post-O'Reilly world, the discourse is dominated by what I would say we might call the Collins-Kenny-Leahy or Cokie version of the public interest. Very conservative and a little insidery. Neither Stephen nor either of the Pats has ever been associated with the idea that their world, the world of Irish politics, is broken, or with any radical ideas. We need to hear more about the public interest from them. And indeed, I'd humbly suggest that we need to hear more about the public interest and the common good at the McGill Summer School. In general, I'd say in this society, nobody really believes in the public interest, in bringing it to bear in every situation, in elevating it, discussing it, and ramming it home. And I want to talk just a little bit about the common good. Okay, 3 moments. It seems to me that we could agree that the common good involves promoting competent people who are not obsessed with themselves, who are economically literate, eradicating nepotism and corruption, encouraging equality of opportunity, and encouraging sustainability with due regard to the disadvantaged and the future. Now, who could disagree with that? Practically, I would say that the answer is for citizens to be educated. There's clearly a serious problem with civics education in school. People should be kids should be educated that choosing leaders at every level should be done not in the interests of the individual, not in the interests of the voter, but primarily in the interests of the society that people are aspiring to. There is such a thing as society, and we should vote for it. Okay, I'm going to deal briefly with the tribunals, as others will deal with them lately, but I do have strong views. I think the media failed to focus on one of the key things relating, the key findings of the Moriarty Tribunal, which I think was about the civil service. Perhaps because Moriarty had to rewrite a small section of his report after an earlier draft was apparently unsustainably critical of civil servants, the media downplayed the extraordinary findings on how senior civil servants in the Department of Communications handled the tendering process. The Secretary-General of that department was not concerned by Lowry's failure to keep the normal distance from O'Brien. The tribunal found that he effectively they effectively rejected most of his evidence on this, referring at times to the Secretary-General's evidence as bizarre, without foundation in fact, and not reliable. I think that was very significant, and maybe in the focus on Lowry and O'Brien, that was missed. I would say that one of the ways that Moriarty arose was because of negligent public servants with a pro-ministerial deference and a fetish for dynamic businessmen. I want to talk briefly about Mahon. And I would say that Mahon, again, it was widely lauded in the press, but I would say that it mainly nailed easy targets. 4 dead dinosaur councillors, 5 red-toothed, long sidelined rezoning machines, and Olivia Mitchell. But in the rezoning that I was opposing 20 years ago, the findings fell well short of implicating anyone who could be described as the political establishment, though it certainly nails the developers and corrupt Frank Dunlop. But as long ago as 1993, we highlighted the fact that a large number of councillors changed their minds. And subsequently it emerged that there were reasons, or that there were strange circumstances accompanying those changes of mind. Monarch Properties had distributed €167,000 to councillors. Frank Dunlop, who mysteriously came on board at the last minute in Cherrywood, confessed himself a crook. There were donations across the board to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, for example. Albert Reynolds received 5,000 donations from the developers of Cherrywood in a letter that referred to the positive role of Fianna Fáil councillors in facilitating the rezoning. 9 out of 12 of the Fine Gael councillors who would talk to their party's internal inquiry in 2000 had received money from Frank Dunlop or from Monarch in the period when they were concerned with the Cherrywood vote. But what I was surprised about was that the tribunal didn't even attempt to ask the councillors why they changed their minds after receiving money from Dunlop or Monarch. Though that didn't actually stop them hauling them in and asking them endless questions. The report almost entirely omits conclusions on this endless stream of dodgy evidence. Someone needs to do, I think, and I don't know anyone who's read the whole Mahon report, but somebody should do a survey on what percentage of the evidence that was heard by the tribunal was actually never resolved in any way, one way or the other, by the tribunal in the end. It just died a death. And of course, in the tribunal, we heard nothing about life beyond the red cow. Okay, I want to turn then very finally to the tribunals, their recommendations and the potential for prosecutions. I think on Moriarty, it's fair to say that the government is not going as far as Moriarty wanted to in terms of restrictions on donations to political parties. Mahon was of more concern to me, and many of the recommendations actually overlap with the Moriarty recommendations. But the tribunal recommended that both the National Development Plan and the National Spatial Strategy should be placed on a statutory footing. And it's not clear if government is intending to do that. If they were placed on a statutory footing, if they had teeth, then it would be impossible for councillors up and down the country to flout them. That would be a very serious gesture of seriousness of intent in terms of ensuring that national and local plans are to be implemented. The tribunal recommended that the Minister for the Environment's ability to give directions to regional authorities and local planning authorities. Again, this is a major phenomenon. When local authorities introduce plans that are in breach of plans higher up in the hierarchy, it's very important that the Minister should intervene and have a power to insist that they comply with plans. But the truth is that ministers have been very loath to do that because it's perceived as interfering with local democracy, and it's particularly difficult for them if they're interfering with councillors of their own persuasion. So it's important that an independent regulator should come in and take that power away from the minister, because it should be exercised in a non-political way. And again, it's essential if we're going to see plans actually implemented, which I would say is the simplest route to proper planning. And the government has refused to budge from its current proposals to reduce the limits of individual permissible donations to €600 to an individual candidate or 1,500 to a political party, which I think is very serious. There's a wide disparity between what Mahon recommended and what the government seems to be pursuing. Of course, there's much welcome legislation emanating from this government, which I won't go into, but the whistleblowers legislation and proposed legislation on lobbying is long overdue. Then finally, I think it's scandalous, and it's an extraordinary indictment of this democracy that so few of the tribunal villains have actually, in fact, none of the tribunal, or so few of the tribunal villains have faced prosecutions. And I'd say, I think anybody looking at it can see that there's ample scope for prosecutions against 10 or 12 of the lead players in both of the tribunals. For example, Haughey could have faced criminal action for theft of Brian Lennon's senior's medical fund, for corruption in his dealings with Ben Dunn, and for corruption in taking money from a Saudi diplomat. And it's surprising still that CAB hasn't intervened to take the lands at Concealy back for the public, given that so much of Haughey's financing was derived corruptly. Lowry, it's very strange that there hasn't been an action against Lowry, particularly for his blatantly corrupt action in seeking to alter Ben Dunn's rent. Similarly, an action against Ben Dunn would seem extremely well grounded. As regards Mahon, obviously it's difficult to pin down where Bertie got the mysterious 215,000, which he went to so much effort to cover up. But clearly an action should lie against Bertie for perjury at the tribunal and against his mates who backed up his story that ultimately the tribunal found not to be true. In fact, there's even scope, I wonder if there are any takers, for a private prosecution against the former Taoiseach. So finally, in synopsis, For cultural reasons, we're too focused on the short term in this country and not very good with rules. We don't hear enough about the common good, and maybe we haven't realised that that's still the case. Implementation of the recommendations of Moriarty and Mahon is patchy, and we still have very bad planning. Overall, in terms of the quality of planning decisions up and down the country, there's not much change. Much of what happened at the tribunals could happen again. Too many white-collar criminals get away with it because the prosecuting agencies are geared primarily to deal with shoplifters and not with white-collar crime. And overall, essentially, the problem is that the culture hasn't changed. Thank you.